What up, Rumi? Tonight on Neighbors. Tonight's guest is someone who sits right at the crossroads of curiosity and mystery. She hosts the podcast Folkloring, where she explores how folklore and magic show up in everyday life, and the author of Mind Over Magic, a book that pretty much answers the bold question: is magic actually real? If so, can we prove it? Tonight, we're diving into folklore, belief, skepticism, and maybe a little bit more of the unknown. Welcome to the show, Tracy Nicholas. How you doing, Tracy?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on. This is very exciting.
Thank you for being on. I really appreciate it. And before we actually started recording, congratulations on the book signing today and the book release.
Thank you very much. It
You're
was an
welcome.
exciting day. Yeah.
That's what's up. It must be so exciting being able to like publish your ideas and thoughts and have everybody and have people appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really been a kind of wild ride. And I sort of thought maybe I would go down the route of self-publishing, but I was very fortunate to get an amazing publisher, and I'm so glad I did. And it's been a huge learning curve for me for the past year of just what that whole process is. And I'm launching the next part of the process now. So I've got, a small tour scheduled that
Okay.
is going to be fairly local, which is fine. But I don't know where it'll go, and of course, a bunch of podcasts. So yeah, I'm just embarking on the next part of the adventure.
Nah, I know your journey is gonna be amazing because you're an amazing person.
Oh, thank
So
you.
so I know you're gonna reach great heights and help people out and just help people realize the magic in life again.
hmm Yeah, I think it's important. We are busy people, obviously, and people forget to appreciate their spirituality and how important that connecting with, the land around them, their ancestors, their communities. And I think that when you talk about bringing folklore and magic into your day-to-day life, it really helps you make those kinds of connections.
I feel you on that. And what originally pulled you into like folklore and magic? When did that spark happen?
Oh, I think I've got a story that most people who are into folklore absolutely have, which is it drew me in as a child. And I was very lucky because my local town library must have had a librarian that was super into folklore,
Yeah.
because we had a great section, and it was folklore from around the world. So it wasn't just, those standard like Grimm brothers and Anderson, like it was African folklore and Chinese folklore. And so I really got, a broad spectrum, and I was just fascinated by it. And I never stopped, even though I spent a large part of my career in corporate America. I worked as an executive in construction for almost 20 years. And I just really always wanted to come back to the folklore. And so I was very lucky about 10 years ago to be able to like quit the corporate world and start to work. Well, at the time I had a game design business, but I did a
Hey,
series.
that's cool.
Yeah, I did a series of games that were based on folklore from around the world. So I got into researching it. And then eventually, of course, I got into podcasting. And I think the book, how I got into that, I've always been kind of into it. I've always kind
Yeah.
of had a magical side to my life. And, sometimes it's less than others. Sometimes it would just be like I'd be doing smudging in my house to, clear the energy.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's more like now it's definitely more involved. So yeah, it's just always been a part of my life as far as I can remember.
Now I get you on that because me just giving you a little background on myself. I come from a Dominican household, so I'm Hispanic. So there's a lot of, I don't want to call it witchcraft, but there's a lot of like white magic and folklore in our household as well. You know what I mean? So I definitely get it because I've seen it since I was a little guy.
Yeah, I think that most people do have magical parts of their life. And I think that we don't always acknowledge them because we say, like, these magical practices are normal. Like, people talk about their intuition all the time. And
Yeah.
it's like, I'm sorry, you just knew something was going to happen in the future. And so you took action to mitigate whatever that was. And we act like that's a completely normal thing. it's like you just read the future. Sure, that's normal. Or people that go to church, right?
Yeah,
Like they have communion. And the belief there is that, that actually those wafers are the body of Christ, and the wine or grape juice or whatever you have is the blood of Christ. And they actually say it really is, you know. And so, part of me is like, okay, that's a little vampire zombie for my taste because
yeah,
it's eating
true.
flesh. Yeah. But they do believe that that's a real thing. And it's like, so this piece of bread turned into the flesh of Christ. Like, how is that not magic? But we act like, hey man, that stuff's normal. But then you start to talk about energy work or whatever, and people are like, oh, that's super weird.
Why you think is that? Like, you will believe like religious like transmutation and like certain parts of faith where it kind of crosses the line between like the physical world that we know and like the spiritual world. Why you think that sometimes we'll accept one thing but not the other?
I think that it's really what we're taught to believe.
Yeah,
I myself went to catechism every Saturday for years. I got my first communion, and as children, we're taught these things are real, and we're taught the same kinds of things in folklore. We're taught that there are official folklore stories, and
yeah,
that's not really true. Like folklore was always a kind of storyteller, person to person kind of thing. And folk tales were different depending on who the storyteller was and where they were in the world, and those kinds of things. So we're given an official version of a lot when we're little kids. And we take that on and we forget that somebody just taught us that. And we think that's reality. So I think that it's when you talk about magic,
yeah.
so many fantastical things have been claimed. Like, I am not going to say, like, I'm going to wave my wand or whatever and have a bag of money appear, right? Like,
Yeah,
and and so when people are skeptical, it's easy to see why, because there are lots of stories like this. But it's like the stories of magic in the Bible. There's a lot of magic in the Bible.
yeah.
And when I had a minister tell me this many years ago. He said, the problem is that the Bible is filled with truth, but there are a lot of people who can't discern the difference between truth and fact.
That is
And
true.
so, yeah, and we tell stories because we tell them about things that are important to us. And so, a lot of those stories that we have, if it's folklore, if it is spiritual kind of learnings, those are about things that matter to us. And for a lot of human history, that was about whether we could shelter ourselves, whether we could feed ourselves, whether we could keep safe in, the forest.
Yeah,
And so that's where some of our really important stories come from. And we also tell stories about morality, right? So here are the right ways to act. And here's what happens if you act in these wrong ways. And so that's what a lot of stories that institutions tell us come from. They're trying to say, here's how you need to be, and look at what happens if you don't.
I feel you on that. Do you feel that most like folklore, or at least the ones that you're really interested in, have more of a morality feel versus like the fantastical magic that now modern day people perceive magic is? Like, not like Harry Potter, but like real life magic, like manifestation, or like somebody working towards something and it happens because they had like the right energy towards it.
Well, I think that as a folklorist, I don't care much if something is real or not, right? I'm going to look at
Mm,
what people believe and why they believe it, because that's what's important to me. I think that a lot of what we think of as magic is, well, a lot of it has some scientific basis that we can go back and say the science is there to tell us these things work. But when we started telling the stories, the science wasn't there. And so people, when, like, for example, you hear people talk about cutting ties, cutting energetic ties, right?
Yeah.
And they, light a candle and they are candles and they tie strings between it and wait for them to burn down. And then, they're using a lot of symbolism there. But when we look at actually where the science is, and we've had this science for 100 years, like Einstein was talking about this. When you talk about quantum physics, right, there is such a thing known as quantum entanglement.
Yeah.
And that is, an actual physical connection between people that have had, some sort of communication or connection or what have you. And it doesn't matter the distance between them, but that on the quantum level is a real connection. And so when you know that, and it's a connection that is real and physical and energetic. And it's like, well, now all of a sudden cutting energetic ties doesn't sound so made up and woo woo.
No, when you put it like that, and you have and that's why I'm thinking like modern society is leading to, like, a lot of the older belief systems is now being proven by like things like, quantum physics, and we're finding out that particles are connected even though they're traversing like the distance of the universe. We're seeing that energy is an actual thing, and it's being constant, you know what I mean? And how
Right.
we're, and like, even though I might be vibrating at, let's say, a low level, my energy may affect somebody else, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that we've got good evidence that that is true too. Like, there is no one out there at this point that hasn't been to like a concert or a play and it's like just on fire, right? And you're
Yeah.
just like, oh, the energy is so good. And it's like all of the people, it's the musicians or the actors and the people in the audience, and it's just like it rises and you can feel it. And so, I mean, I think right there, that is proof that we share energy.
Yeah.
And in sharing that, and you can feel it when it's bad, when the energy is off, and it's like, they can be technically perfect, and it can be just like a bad energy night. And so I think that, again, that's an experience we all have, and we all know it. And you don't like necessarily, I mean, there is science out there for talking about how people exchange energy, but like that is such a common example. Again, it's a thing that people believe that is magical, right?
Yeah.
And we're so trained to think that as individuals, we are silos and we're cut off from other people. And then we get into an experience like a concert and we're like, everybody's sharing their energy, or something like Burning Man. When people leave Burning Man, they can't describe it. They're like, I can't even tell you what it was like. It was an experience, you know?
Listen, I've been trying to drag my friends to Burning Man for the last 3 years, and none of these guys is like trying to go, but I'm gonna drag them out there. We're
Yeah,
definitely gonna go to the desert. Yeah, yeah. I definitely want to experience it.
and it's supposed to be. I have not been myself, and I'm kind of an old right now, so I don't know that I want to go for that level of discomfort. But it's a cool, interesting experiment. That first of all, money's no good there. And so people have to rely on each other. And I think that that's part of the basis of why it's such a wild experience, because we normally don't have that reality. And then people are just out there, and, some people are sober, some people are not, but it's just walking around and, 24 hours a day, stuff is happening. And so I
Yeah.
think that, yeah, it's got to be just taking you out of your real life and putting you into this magical world, and it's going to change you.
No, it definitely is, especially when you have like group experiences like that.
Mhm.
You tend to feel like not only euphoria, but you tend to feel that connection again with people.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
in my personal experiences, like when I set off to like start DJing and doing the podcast and whatnot, it was an experience that I had with my best friend who is also responsible for the podcast happening. He took me to like my first like big festival slash rave, and that's where I like figured out that's DJing and entertaining was what I wanted to do. But in hindsight, the energy there was crazy because you felt connected with everybody. You felt this sense of oneness,
Yeah.
but with multiple people. You know what I mean? And that's
Yeah.
something that I feel that modern society now is trying to take away from the human experience.
Right, right. And I want to kind of circle back to something you said about energy.
Yeah,
You were talking about how, like, if your energy gets low, it's not great. And we hear a lot, like, raise your energy. You gotta, and I think that there is a little bit of confusion around that because human beings have a certain energetic vibration.
yeah,
And and to be healthy, like you can get outside of it, like outside of that range, but it's between about 7 hertz and 20 hertz, right? And we need to stay within that. Now, if we start to get too high in that range, we start to have things like anxiety, insomnia, things that are like keeping us ramped up. But if we
yeah,
get too low in the range, then we hit things like depression and, inability to do basic functions. And
yeah,
so and certainly we don't want to get outside of the range because then those things come in the extreme. And we spend a lot of our days sitting in front of computers, electronics, Wi-Fi, everything
yeah,
around us. And those vibrations are very high. They're higher than the normal human range. And so when we do that all day long, our vibration gets pulled up. And it's interesting because what happens if you go out into nature, right? The energy of like the plants and the trees and the earth itself is lower. So it brings our energy back down. And so, people are talking about like, oh, tree huggers, right? Well, that's a real thing. Like, we
yeah,
know that if you spend all of your time with your vibration getting pushed up higher and higher, that when you pull it down, you feel better. And that's why people do forest bathing and all sorts of stuff. And I think that when people started doing that, they knew they felt better, but they didn't know why. And that's where, you get some more skeptical people being like, oh, that's so weird. What are you doing? But again, in the past, 30 years, the science has come into play that we start to understand why that affects our body the way it does.
yeah, true. And just I want to also circle back to when you were explaining the range of frequency, right?
Mhm, mhm.
It makes sense that once you pass like 20 hertz, you'll get things like insomnia and anxiety. When you reach below a certain threshold, you'll get depression. It makes sense because if you look at the I don't want to call it a disease, but if you look at the mental health problem or whatever you want to call it, you'll see that those reflect those vibrational states like insomnia, not being able to slow down, or anxiety, always being in a panic. And when you have depression, you're slowed down, you're in slow motion. So it makes sense that those those things like reflect that frequency and that energy.
Yeah, and the only reason I really, like, brought that up is because people are thinking, like, the higher the better, right? Because we all like to be, like,
Yeah,
energetic and high energy and all of that, and that's not really true. We need to find the right balance, which is why things like going out into nature or meditating or, a lot of the things that people do to kind of regulate keeps them more in the middle of that range. And I think that's an important thing to notice. I think we feel the sort of depression side of things a little bit more keenly than we do the anxiety because we're taught that like we have to be productive, we have to be doing stuff, we have to be like giving
oh,
back to, yeah, like
yeah,
work, right? And so anxiety feels like it helps us do those things, right? Like if you're anxious, you can be up at 2 in the morning, like working on sending emails or whatever ridiculous thing you're doing at 2 in the morning,
yeah,
right? And it feels like we get rewarded for that, like the higher end of those struggles. And we get punished for the lower end, like, oh, you're lazy. Oh, go for a walk. Oh, just, like
Yeah.
stop dwelling on bad stuff. And I personally, like, I hate toxic positivity. And because it's like, oh, don't ever complain, don't, like, be grateful, it's like sometimes not great things happen, and we need to acknowledge those.
Yeah, because
um
you have to kind of like process through your own emotions and be able to express it. Like,
yeah,
like I get it when people say, what's the point of complaining? Like, and they say it's a waste of energy. But without complaining and without releasing that, that tension in yourself, that
yep,
might cause you to lower your vibration or move through the spectrum in a way that you really didn't want to.
absolutely. And I think that, again, we're told that complaining is bad, but when you look at it and maybe reframe it as processing, right? Like, this difficult thing happened and you're processing through your emotions so you can move on, put it away behind you, and just, do whatever it is that you need to do after that. I think, and I think in some ways society treats women as it's more okay to kind of process those emotions than men. And I think men are in a difficult place a lot of times because it's like, oh, men don't cry, or men, suck it up, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that can be really difficult to try and live up to that societal standard that is unrealistic for human beings.
No, I completely get that. I completely get that aspect of it. Like, especially when you may be like the only son, or you're the head guy in your family and whatnot.
Right.
People look up to you to be like the strong, silent type that got their head on straight and is always able to push forward even though things are grim.
Yeah.
From personal experience, yeah, um, your emotions do take a toll, and sometimes you do need that release, but and this is coming from a predominantly Hispanic household. We're taught to, you gotta suck it up, even though you gotta process your emotions, you gotta process it healthily, but
Mhm.
there's not really much room for vocalization, I would say.
Well, and I think it's interesting because on the topic of emotion, both men and women get punished for it. And I think that women get punished for being, you know, too emotional in the workplace, which I don't really think is true, but they get accused of that, right? But men
Yeah.
get punished for being too emotional, sort of in their personal lives. And so, it's like we both kind of, like, both sides kind of suffer from what are society's expectations, and it's not really anything that's real. We just made all of that up. There's nothing real in saying that men should suck it up, right? That's just a
Yeah.
thing people made up. And
Yeah.
there's nothing real about saying that, if a woman is assertive, she's, pushy, or whatever. Those things are just trying to force people into societal roles that we had once, and I think have faded a lot, but they're
Yeah.
still prevalent in a big way in our society, because people grew up with those rules of how women are supposed to be and how men are supposed to be. And
I, do-
so,
I
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say that I really do think that because of the transition into and this is just coming from my age, but the transition from, like, I would say, the older analog version of life versus this new digital version of life,
Mhm.
there's been an influx of information and knowledge, and especially with mental health, we see a big influx of that. You could see that from example like the 90s. People weren't really talking about autism, but in 2026 we have this whole spectrum of autism that goes from very minor to nonverbal or non-functioning autism. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So I think like the societal roles is also kind of somewhat similar, where everybody was like, hey, we're supposed to be this, but now that we're in this age, they're like, hey, no, we could kind of like go through the spectrum. Like, if you need to be emotional, be emotional. If you need to like release, don't hold that in, because now we know that in the long term kind of like messes you up.
Well, and I think that it's interesting because knowing that we're starting to talk more about this, and there's a lot of pushback against things
Mm,
like autism, and people are looking to blame, you know, whatever, like vaccinations and all of that. But you have to understand that, like, before, there would be, and again, people are telling stories about what's important to them. And so when you look at stories like the fairies putting changelings in, right? They change out a child for this fairy child who doesn't act quite right, who doesn't look quite right, right? And
yeah,
so you start to look at people with disabilities, and a lot of children who are born differently abled, right? They were put in those categories. And so when we look at, how people are treated for different kinds of abilities, but then we look back at those stories, I mean, there were children that were like, oh, this is a changeling, right? And maybe it was a child with autism or Down syndrome or whatever it was. And they didn't define it as this is a medical condition. They defined it as this is a changeling. And they would take children like that and go put them out in the woods to like either freeze or starve to death, because they're like, the fairies will come get it. It's their child. It's not my child. And so it's definitely less brutal than it used to be. But that's where you hear stories like changelings and people who are, there are a lot of like brutal fairy tales that are about people who have different conditions, different that we would consider medical conditions. And again,
yeah,
that's just the science catching up with magical thinking, right?
yeah, definitely. And I was just about to ask you, is there like a large or from like your studies, is there like a large percentage of like folklores that reflect modern day things like autism, Down syndrome, and you'll see the connection between the two, and you'll be like, oh, they were really talking about this, and this is how we're defining it now.
Mhm. I think you can look at the older stories and see a lot of that. I think that, when we talk about different monsters and different, creatures, there's a lot of that. I think modern folklore does less of that, probably based on the fact that we acknowledge that those are, people with different that are born differently, right?
Yeah.
And not even, because I think a lot of more people are on like spectrums than we admit. We act like everybody's like a certain way. I don't think that's really true. But
I completely agree with you on that one.
yeah, I think that when we look at modern folklore, those I think what's interesting about modern folklore, and I'm looking at like urban legends and cryptids and sort of what we see like alien abductions, all of
Mhm.
that kind of folklore. I think that those stories are more about what we're afraid of, and and I've noticed it, like in recent years, I have noticed there's been a trend like UFO abductions, right?
Yeah.
Which to me are really the same as fairy stories, right? You're off in the dark by yourself somewhere, and you stumble into like some bad situation. You're taken away for a period of time, bad things happen to you, and then you come back, and maybe it's a day later or a year later or 100 years later, or it's 3 days that you've been missing or a month and so like to me those stories are very much the same, but they're well, but the aliens just have better technology, really.
True.
And so we do tell the same kinds of stories over time, but they keep reflecting our current technology, socioeconomic status, like where the world is. And I think that's why some of those change. but I've noticed a trend lately about people who are seeing aliens in much more urban environments. And we used to like it used to be the,
Yeah,
car on the back road and a bright light comes and you lose the power to the car and then
yeah,
you don't remember. Yeah. But now you start to see videos there. I remember there's this very sad one of a woman on a plane who was screaming about this one person who she's like, that's an alien. It's an alien. And there are like multiple stories of people on trains or buses saying, oh, there's aliens here. And I think that, again, as a folklorist, it does not matter to me whether the stories are true or not. It matters what people believe. And I
yeah,
think that those stories of urban kind of aliens reflects how we are feeling about each other as people, because we're getting a lot of information and misinformation about that others people, right? And when
yeah,
you're othering people, and it's easier to treat them like they're not human or not as human as you. And even like with the changelings, they were able to go put those babies out in the woods to die because they othered them.
yeah,
And so when we're othering people, it we start to say, okay, we're afraid of each other now. So the danger isn't out in the woods like it used to be. Because like you used to be dangerous to be out at night in the woods by yourself, right? Now it's more dangerous to be around other people because we are so awful to each other, right?
yeah,
And it's not safety in numbers, it's divide and conquer, and look at people around you and say, you're not as human as me, you're not as human as me. And I think that that's an interesting update to how we are seeing urban legends and how we are seeing some of those stories. So I don't know if that answered your question.
no, no, it did, but it also brought up another question of mine. So, as modern day folklorists, right?
Mhm.
And you study the past and the present. Where the past folklores, we saw that people were more afraid of the external, right? Like going out into the forest or meeting, these entities that might harm them. Versus now, where we're, more of afraid of the internal because we're seeing that human society itself, oh, we're not treating each other correctly and we're not, being the best to each other.
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's and certainly there's always been like folklore within people's homes. There are house spirits that do certain things and all of that. But yeah, I think a lot of the danger is coming home. It's coming to our day-to-day lives because we believe that the monsters are each other now.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna be quite honest, and this is, a personal opinion. The way the way social media and the news portrays, society now, it puts us against each other. It really shows you like the evils of humanity, and it's like you never see people with positive stories be uplifted in that same manner.
Yeah.
Like a great example that I have is that, on my Instagram, for instance, I follow a page called New York Uncut, and there was an incident where a young man was, you know unalived in the train station in the Bronx, and
Mhm.
it's crazy because, being from New York, I know that, things happen, but just now that it's so prevalent, just to like see it there is crazy because now it's like, all right, cool. Now when I go out, I have to be aware of everyone around me because I never know if I may be the next subway story, as
Right.
us New Yorkers like to call it.
And I think in a lot of ways, that's why people turn to magic,
Mm,
because magic is it sort of gives you some answers and it gives you some control, you know, and people have long prayed, right? And prayer is another very common thing. And I think the difference that a lot of people feel like between magic and prayer is in prayer, you're asking someone else to help you or fix it. And in magic, you're saying, I'm going to do it myself. And so I think that it does give people back a certain sense of control. It gives people, reasons for why things happen the way they do. And there's a lot of people who still believe in things like curses. And back in the day, when one family fell ill and another one did not, it's easy to start looking around for reasons. And if you don't understand what viruses are and what bacteria is and how some of those things work, you don't understand that you're getting the plague from a bite from a flea that has this virus because there are rats in your home and there are fleas
Yeah.
on the rats. Like, you don't know any of that. All you know is some people get sick and some people don't. So people again start to look around for the marginalized people. In a lot of cases, it was the older, wise woman who was giving out herbal remedies or doing little love spells because that's, what people thought was important, and saying, oh, witch, right?
Yeah.
And it's how we try and make sense of things. And again, people still do it. They're like, gosh, I have such bad luck. Like, everything has gone wrong this year. And they're like, maybe I've been cursed, you
True.
know? And it's true. And again, like we said, we exchange energy. And so maybe a curse is that, of just saying, hey, I'm going to send you some really negative energy. And if you have a connection with a person, maybe it does impact them. Maybe it impacts their mood or the way that they look at the world. And so what they're looking at is, like, I'm going to look at all the negative things and focus on those. And so, that's part of magic too, is you get what you focus on, right?
Yeah. I got you. So what would you say would be like a common misconception that people have now versus like real magic versus like the fantasy magic that we all grew up with?
hmm Um, I think that people think that spells and ritual and stuff are going to produce massive dramatic outcomes.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's really true. I think that the way that magic works, I look at something like The Secret, right? And manifesting. People are always talking about manifesting. And I think
Yeah.
it's sort of the right idea, but you're not going to sit in your house and be like, I've got my vision board, and so I'm going to get this mansion. It's more like subtle um, influence on the world around you. But you have to sort of marry that with the mundane, right? If I'm not starting my business or working or whatever, I'm not going to get that mansion,
That's a
right?
fact.
And so and I think that there's a misconception that like magical and spiritual is separate from mundane. I think it's all the same thing.
No,
And
it's definitely all connected.
yeah. And so, but I mean, our brains are really powerful, right? Like, if you look at something like the placebo effect, and again, like, very well documented, we know this works, right? Give someone a pill and it does nothing, like mechanically, like it does
Yeah.
absolutely nothing, and they get better, right? And because the brain decided, hey, I took a pill, pills make me better, I'm going to get better. And it heals the body. And the fascinating thing about the placebo effect is that it works whether or not people know it is a placebo. And it doesn't work as well if they know as if they don't. But it does work. And that goes back to ritual practices. So the ritual is taking a pill, and your body is like not getting anything. Like, when I define magic, I define it as changing the environment, either within you or outside of you, with no mechanical or physical intervention, right? And so that's what the placebo is, right? You take something, it doesn't do anything to you, and your brain just heals you anyway. It's like, how magical is that?
True.
So I think we have to look at what we define as magic, and those are parts of what people have misconceptions about. And that's why a lot of people who are like, "Oh, I want to do these magical things," they're treated like, "Oh, you're crazy." But some of it, like, I'll do ritual and I like it. It's fun, but I'm doing it because I like doing the ritual and I like the symbolism of taking the time to stop and do it, as opposed to, just being like, I'm sending a curse out. So I think that it's valid that ritual is useful to us in a symbolic way.
Okay. So, and this is just backtracking a little bit, and I'm gonna tie everything together.
Mhm.
So, like with manifestation, right? A lot of people believe that manifestation is this thought process that if I think that I'm gonna get something, I'll receive it. But what I've seen, or at least what I've been noticing, is that without action and without intention, it doesn't happen. Like, just going back to the example of getting the mansion, right? If you're not
Right.
out there working and you're now putting your intention to get this mansion, the universe, and I know this is going to sound corny, the universe is not going to put those opportunities in front of you. You know what I mean?
Oh, exactly right. I think that manifestation is a useful tool because it gets your mind focused on where you need to be putting your time and effort and energy. I think that that is the most useful part about manifestation. And whether you do it in a ritual, and whether maybe that ritual is creating your vision board, or maybe it's lighting some candles and, I don't know, chanting, whatever your ritual is, it helps you focus on what you want. And our energy goes to what it is that we are thinking the most about, right? Our thoughts
Yeah.
follow where, the energy follows our thoughts. And so if you're thinking, oh, I'm really unlucky, and you're looking for ways in which bad things happen, or you're thinking, oh, I really want to have this successful career, then that's where your energy is going. And I'm going to be much more excited about writing, the next post on Substack, or making the next video that I want to sell, or writing my book, if I'm like, I can look to the future and see where the success comes, and not just like, I'm going to be here, like, spending my time and energy. I'm not going to spend an hour meditating on what that mansion's going to look like, right? I'm going to be focusing myself on what it is that those outcomes are in a very positive way. And I think that's where manifestation as a tool can be useful, however you want to experience it.
And I completely agree with that. And yet again, backtracking towards ritual, with rituals, I feel that with rituals, it's a device
Mhm.
used to like focus that energy and that intent.
Yeah,
So like, so just like you would take your car to a mechanic to get tuned, you're kind of using that ritual to like tune your energy towards that end goal. And
right.
and what people don't, well, at least the misconception that I'm seeing now in modern day, even though people don't believe in quote unquote magic, those rituals kind of like help us focus in and like zero in on what we want, even though it might seem like we're trying to do like this old school magic kind of thing, but it's really just focusing in and just realizing that, all right, these are my intentions, this is how I'm going to move forward. And doing a little chanting or a little meditation towards that is just sharpening the sword.
Well, and I think that Any magical practice, it's called a practice, right?
Yeah.
So you're doing it, you have to do it all the time. And when you're talking about chanting, that is like sound itself is affecting sort of our vibrational frequency. So again, we get back to the science of, what frequency, like what does raising the energy through clapping or stomping or bells or our voices, like all of those things affect our vibration in a real physical way. And so, when we look at that, that is something that we can say, yes, there's science behind it. And the same with meditation, because
Mm.
if you're out there in the world and someone hits your car, right? That is upsetting, and it's difficult to stay sort of calm and balanced in that moment. But if you've been practicing, if you've been meditating all along, it's much easier to sort of keep your energy calm and focus on the matter at hand instead of getting all worked up. And so again, the thing about magic is practice, 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 right? And you have to be doing it on a regular basis, like working out. You're not going to go to the gym and lift like what you were lifting 10 years ago if you haven't been to the gym in 10 years, right?
That's a
You need to
that's a
start where
fact.
you are. Yeah, you need to build up, and I think that's the reality of magic that most people don't want to admit. They want it to be fun and cool and interesting, and they don't put in the day-to-day work that helps them be better at it.
I got you. Do you feel that that's how life is now? That people just want like instant gratification versus like putting in the work and like enjoying the journey to their goals?
I think in a lot of ways it is because of how we are again manipulated by social media. We're like, it's hard for some people to watch a 30-second video,
That's
right?
a fact. That's a big fact. Yeah.
Yeah, much less sit down and read a book or take an hour and do a ritual and then, wait for your candles to burn down. It's hard for people to focus because we are so inundated and so bombarded that we do want quick fixes because everything is quick now.
Yeah.
And we have to be quick, and and now we've got AI, and it's like, oh my god, you could produce 10 times the content, and you can do all of this and get more eyes and more followers. And it's like, well, yeah, but at what cost, right?
True.
Like there are a ton of like AI written books out there right now that are terrible, and a ton of people who took that shortcut and they became less proficient at writing because of it. And that again, practice, practice, practice. You have to, like, I'm not going to stay a decent writer, hopefully decent writer, if I don't ever do it.
True
And
enough.
that, yeah, and we lose those skills. And I've had a bunch of different careers in my life, and like I go back to my master's thesis and I'm reading it, and it's about using strategy to develop small to mid-sized nonprofits. Like I was very focused on strategic change at the time, and I like go back and read my thesis, and I'm like, dang, I was really smart back then. I don't know any of that now.
No, but life change. People change throughout their whole life, and we're allowed to play in the spectrum. And especially that you've had so much experience that you went from corporate to being a writer to a creative now, and also ushering not ushering in, but like shedding light on what real magic is. Because
Mhm.
the thing about society and what I've noticed about people is that you could bring up these crazy concepts to people and they might not agree with it, but at the
Mhm.
end of the day, some people are just doing it naturally. Like and this is the difference between like what we believe magic is and what real magic is. Real magic is the intention and the action that leads to the result.
Yep.
The opportunities will arise no matter what. But if you place yourself in that light and in that frequency, it's gonna happen.
Yeah. It definitely will. And I think also, we see that if you believe something is not possible, you will not be able to do it.
That is true.
And the example I use there is with the 4-minute mile. And there was a time in history, I think it was in the 40s, where it was believed through scientific study that it was not possible for a human body to run a mile faster, like in under 4 minutes. Like just did not, it could not be done. That was the limits of the human body. And then some British guy did it.
Mm.
Right? And it was like, oh, okay. And then within the next couple of years, like people broke it over and over. Like they kept going faster and faster and faster because they suddenly believed it was possible. And so with a magical practice, I think it is, again, start to pay attention. Pay attention to the things that are an easy inroad for you. If you believe in intuition, right? Pay attention to when your intuition hits. And does your brain say, oh, no, that's a coincidence? Well, maybe it's not. Maybe you need to say, okay, maybe I did have this sort of knowing beforehand. And in that way, I think you can start to develop your own belief system around the reality of magic.
No, definitely. Um, and just going back off of that is just like for the example that you put, the 4-minute mile, right?
Mhm.
Once it was believed that it was impossible, but now that's just a standard. Everybody's trying to do a mile in 4 minutes. You see the most athletic guys try to do it, and you see the most big guys try to do it. Like even before I had my Achilles injured, when I was in the gym, I tried to do the 4-minute mile, and I achieved it on several occasions. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
And I mean,
So
yeah, that wasn't even 100 years ago.
yeah,
That like and people 100% believed it. Like an Olympian couldn't do it, right? Until somebody did.
yeah. Now it's just a minute and mile in 4 minutes. That's the standard for the army now too.
Yeah.
So if magic was scientifically proven tomorrow, what changes would you see first in society?
Well, I think that that's a complicated question because some of magic is proven, right? Like the placebo effect, like energetic transfer, like morphic resonance, which we didn't really get into, but look it up if you're interested because it's really interesting stuff, and even down to like how time works, right? They're talking about time at the Center for Time Study at the University of Sydney. And they're saying time is probably not what we think it is right now. Time is another dimension, and it's a physical place where you are. It's not just sort of this unrolling of events that go forward. Like you are, they call it the cube universe theory. And in the
Yeah,
cube theory, that we're in a place and we perceive it as different time, but it's not. It's like a physical spot that we're in. And if you think about that, then you can say, well, maybe intuition is just those moments when you're moving through that physical space where you get a little glimpse into the next spot you're going to be in, like a little bit before you get there or whatever. And so I think that a lot of magic has been proven. Now, as far as the things that we can't prove yet, and there's plenty that we
yeah,
cannot prove yet. I am of the belief that right now we can't prove whether or not like ghosts and spirits are real, because we don't really understand what consciousness is. And
true.
so if you can't define consciousness, if you can't prove it and understand it and know how it works, there's no possible way to prove whether or not it goes past death. And I'm not willing to talk about pseudoscience because it's like, let's just wait and get there. We're not there right now. And that's different than belief. And if you believe in it, if you've had experiences that support it, of course you're going to believe. If you've run into a ghost, you're going to believe in ghosts, right?
Yeah, of course.
And if you haven't, you're going to be like, maybe that's possible. But you also may be like, of course, that's not possible. It's never happened to me. I've been on this planet for 40 years and I haven't, hit that.
Yeah.
So I think that if some things that like spirits and fairies and well, I think that we've already kind of proven aliens are real. I think we're actually there on that one that we know.
they, they've proven that there's bacterial life out there. As far as what modern day science is willing to say, they've proven that there's bacterial life out there. There's been evidence that plankton has been caught growing on the windows of the International Space Station, and
cool.
we know of microbial life that survives in the vacuum of space. So we know there's life out there. We definitely that's a fact. But we don't know if they're
yeah, please God, let us not be the most developed life form.
No. I hope not.
There must be better.
Like me and my friends always have a joke that that Earth is the ghetto planet. That's why we don't see aliens coming over here.
Yeah, exactly.
But like when you're like the alien gets like their first UFO, their parents are like, "Don't go to Earth. Don't pass by that planet. Yeah. Like, please don't ever stop by there.
And if you do, don't unlock your doors."
Yeah. View it from orbit and then get out of there. You don't want to land on that planet. They're not cool people there. You know what I mean? So we're always joking that Earth is the ghetto planet. That's why we never see like intelligent life pass by.
It's true. That's 100% true.
But my real thing is that if a species could traverse time and space in the vast distances of our universe, then things like war, hatred, things of those nature, I don't feel that a species would be able to like really carry that through if they're already like that far advanced that they could like traverse the distances of this universe. You know what I mean?
Right. Okay, but let's go back to your question. So if today things like psychics and fairies and spirits and all of that was proven immediately, I think that what would happen is, first of all, like a major breakdown of society as we know it. But I think that people's like brains would be broken open, and I think there would be a lot of positive fallout. I don't want to say fallout, outcome, I guess. Because people would be able to say, the story we've been told that we are individual silos, that we do not connect with each other or nature or our past or these other, occult kind of beliefs, all of that is not true. We immediately know that. And then we start to say, how am I going to respond knowing that if I go to the coffee shop and I'm an asshole to the barista, can I say that? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, girl.
And I'm going to put something into the collective that we share to make the world worse. Am I still going to do that? Am I still going to be okay with, being a dick? Because I think that a lot of us would say, well, wait a minute. If I don't do my work, if I'm doing my work, I'm making the collective better, not just of people, but of everything. And we suddenly feel the weight of that responsibility. I think that a lot of people will step up to that. And the people who don't will no longer be the people ridiculing the ones who believe it already, they will be the ones that fall by the wayside. And so I think it would be a sort of net, like astounding, astonishing positive if we suddenly were able to say, hey, this stuff is real, and we can throw away the really like negative stuff. People in this world right now are still being murdered because they're accused of being a witch, right?
True.
And so if we knew what was real and what wasn't, we could throw away like the superstitions and the dark kind of focus on like, oh, you know, witches are terrible because they have power that normal people don't. It's like, no, if we know we all have the same power, then we don't need to be afraid that someone is going to have like inappropriate power over us.
I got you. I got you.
So,
And Tracy,
yeah.
so before we wrap up, I'm going to ask you one last question that I ask all my guests. Do you have
Sure.
any final thoughts or advice for the roomies?
I think that if you're starting on your path, just start to notice. Notice coincidences, notice intuition, and look at those things and think to yourself, is this magical? Right? Is this not really a coincidence? Is it something that came together in the right moment? If you're a little further on your path, I say practice. Keep practicing, keep working on what you know is real and right, and develop your own skills and your own beliefs, and that will get your life to a much more magical place. And so, wherever you are on your path, just take the next step. If you believe, it opens up your world to so much more possibility.
I feel you. Roomies, remember, intention with action equals manifestation, and believe in the real magic of life, because life is pretty dope and magical. And with
Yeah.
that, peace out.